Hello and welcome to this download from Blackwell Online. My name is George Miller, and my guest today is Eamon Duffy, Professor of the History of Christianity at Cambridge University. He's the author of the prize-winning book, The Stripping of the Altars, an account of the pre-Reformation Church in England. His new book, Fires of Faith, by contrast, looks at the counter-Reformation of Mary Tudor, also known as Bloody Mary, for the sometimes violent means by which she tried to reimpose Catholicism. During her short reign, nearly 300 Protestants were burnt alive. But setting our modern revulsion for its methods to one side, or at least not allowing them to be the whole story, Fires of Faith is a challenging reassessment of the effectiveness of Mary's regime, generally regarded as a grim throwback to medievalism. I asked Eamon what, in essence, he had set out to examine.
I suppose there are two main lines about the Marian regime that I've raised questions. One is that, in the words of Tom Mayer, Catholicism equaled inefficiency or incompetence. So I wanted to look at the way in which the Marian regime restored Catholicism and to offer a revised account of the degree of success that was involved in that. For example, there's been a very widespread assumption that the regime fatally ignored preaching and the printing press. So I've got chapters on that sort of issue. The other issue I wanted to look at, and this takes up half the book, is the whole terrible question of the campaign against heresy, the burnings. 284 people in just under 4 years. Everybody can agree that this is grim, morally repellent to modern sensibilities. But in addition, there's a very strong historiographical tradition that it was also suicidally misguided, that English sense of fair play was on the side of the victims, that people were inspired by the courage of the Protestant martyrs, that it permanently inoculated the nation against Catholicism, and that even the regime itself, by the end of the 4 years, was realizing it had made a catastrophic error and was backing off. I've gone into that in a great deal of detail. I've mapped the progress of the campaign. I mean, some pretty startling things have emerged from simply recording the burnings on an annual basis, where they were, who was burned, what sort of numbers, in what sorts of places. And what one sees is, rather than the regime backing away from the campaign, an intensification of it. People being burnt in larger groups in smaller numbers of places where Protestantism was strong. So the regime, which begins rather tentatively, worried about the likely impact of these executions on a rather uncertain public opinion. As it progresses, they're actually giving higher profile to the burnings and concentrating them in the places where Protestantism has got a hold. So I suggest that the exact opposite of the received opinion, that this was a political error, is true. In fact, terrible as they were, these burnings were doing what they were supposed to do.
I want to come back to the burnings in a little while, but I wanted to ask you if you could sketch out for us the situation in the country in 1553 when Mary comes to the throne.
It's quite clear that the regime very quickly grasped that Protestantism had made strong inroads in many communities. Places like London had got strong, vigorous, and very committed Protestant minorities committed to the Edwardine religious settlement. That took some of the leaders of the Marian regime by surprise, but they very quickly registered it and adapted to it. So there's no doubt there was a strong Protestant minority, but it's equally clear that the overwhelming majority of people were glad to see the restoration of Catholicism. Mary is, if you like, pushing on an open door in reintroducing Catholicism, but she's also having to deal with a very committed minority who are determined to resist.
With what degree of deliberation was burning, was execution of key Protestants undertaken? I mean, how planned was it, or how improvised was it from what you've researched?
Well, I think everybody knew it was going to happen. The Parliament delayed reenacting the heresy laws till the end of 1554 because they wanted guarantees about the rest of the package of recatholicizing, particularly guarantees about the retention of church property. Once they got that, the heresy laws went through very quickly. They came into effect at the end of January 1555. The first burnings took place in the first week of February. And to begin with, they're targeting clerical leaders. So the first people burnt are very high-profile, if you like, symbolic figures like Bishop Hooper of Gloucester or John Rogers, one of the most famous preachers in London. Thereafter, it spreads out to determined conventiclers. It's steered from the very beginning by the Privy Council, and there is a great deal of direct hands-on intervention. So, for example, the Privy Council sending out directives to local magistrates to divide the counties up into regions and set a magistrate in charge of each region, to organize systems of informers, to send teams of preachers down into the region to explain what's going on and why people have to be burnt. So it is actually quite highly organized.
You had some very interesting things to say in the book about attempts to control the propaganda value, because obviously conducting public executions in a volatile climate is a risky business for any regime.
Absolutely, especially for ideological crime. I mean, all public executions in the early modern period, well, in the first place, they are public. They're not carried out in prison behind closed doors. They're carried out in shared public spaces, and the part of the object is to make an example of the victims. And burning is a shameful death. It's not just painful, it's also, you're shaming the person involved. But of course, when you've got something very powerful like that, gestures by the victims can become very eloquent as well. And there is a sort of struggle that goes on around the stake for, if you like, control of the symbolic language. So, for example, very quickly, a code of conduct for the victims emerges. They kiss the stake as if it were a crucifix. They wear white robes. Now, I mean, the white robes had a practical thing. If you wore thick clothing, it increased the pain of the burning. So wearing a thin nightshirt it shortened your suffering. But it was also an allusion to the white-robed army of martyrs in the book of Revelation. And Protestant sympathizers in the crowds, they began to stage demonstrations. They would scatter themselves among the crowd, and at a signal from a leader, they would surge forward and either drink a toast to the people at the stake or embrace them if they hadn't yet been put onto the pyre. And the authorities elaborated strategies for preventing that. Towards the end of the summer of 1558, the authorities in London had decided that the London evangelicals were so well organized that they were on a hiding-to-nothing burning people in Smithfield, and they took to burning them outside the city walls, in villages near London rather than in London itself, in order to thwart the strategies that the Protestants had developed for exploiting the courage and steadiness of the victims at the stake as signs that what they were dying for was true.